The patrol unit was parked at a 45-degree angle behind the silver Hyundai, close enough that the push bar nearly touched the rear bumper, and that was the first thing she noticed. Not the lights, not the siren, not the uniform already coming toward her window, but the angle, the deliberate proximity, the way it made escape feel theoretical. She had been sitting with her hands on the wheel for 4 minutes. She knew because the clock on the dash read 6:47 when he'd hit the lights and 6:51 now. The engine was off, the AC had stopped. Outside, the Arkansas summer was doing what it did in early August, pressing itself against the glass like something with intentions, a heat that was less a temperature than a presence, the kind that finds the seams in things. She watched him in the side mirror. He was taking his time, standing at the rear of her car, writing something or pretending to, one hand resting on the trunk lid. She could not see his face from here, just his posture, the particular kind of relaxed that isn't actually relaxed, that is instead a performance of a man who has nowhere to be and wants you to know it. He shifted his weight once. His hand stayed on the trunk. She put her hands back on the wheel and looked through the windshield at the road, which ran absolutely straight into the distance and eventually dissolved into a shimmer before disappearing into the tree line. There were no other cars. There had been no other cars for the last 11 miles. On her left was a soybean field that stretched to a flat horizon, and on her right was a line of old timber that hadn't been cleared in decades, the kind of growth that accumulates when nobody owns the land or nobody cares that they do. A rusted metal sign for a gas station that had stopped being a gas station before she was born faced the road from somewhere in the brush, and a crow sat on top of it looking at nothing. He came around to the driver's side and stood there for a moment before bending to the window. He was 40-something, not heavy but solid through the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome 15 years ago and had since settled into something more specific, a hardness that wasn't from difficult living so much as from decisions made and not revisited. Pale eyes. A neat dark uniform with the town's small shoulder patch. His name tag said PRUETT in raised silver letters. His eyes went to her face, then to the tote bag on the passenger seat, then back to her. License and registration. His voice was level, not rude, not friendly. The particular bureaucratic flatness of a man who has said the same sentence 10,000 times and knows that the repetition is itself a kind of authority. She had her license already in her hand. She held it out with the rental agreement folded behind it. He took them without looking at her directly and stepped back. She waited. A dragonfly landed on the hood of her car and sat there for a while, iridescent blue-green, entirely unbothered. And then it lifted and was gone. The buzzing from the soybean field was the only sound, a single sustained note, some insect she couldn't name, the kind of sound that fills silence without relieving it. He came back to the window. "Where you headed, Ms. Voss?" "Texarkana." "What's in Texarkana?" "My mother's." He looked at her the way people look at something they're trying to measure against something else. "You come from Memphis?" "I did. Long way to come on back roads." She didn't answer. It hadn't been a question. "Step out of the vehicle, please." "Can I ask what the stop is for?" "Your right rear brake light's out." She looked at the rearview mirror for a moment. She had checked the lights at the rental lot in Memphis, the way she always did, the way she had done for 20 years out of a habit that had begun as professional caution and become simply habit. She didn't say this. She opened the door and stepped out into the August evening, and the heat hit her immediately and fully, the way it does when you've been sitting in climate control, not gradually but as a single fact about the world. What she knew about herself at this moment. She was 41 years old. She was tired in the way people get tired when they've been on the road since noon. She had eaten a turkey sandwich in a highway pull-off outside of Memphis and nothing since, and she had been trying to reach her mother's facility to say she was running late, and the call had gone to voicemail 3 times. She was wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt and running shoes that were 6 months old and starting to show it. She had short dark hair going gray at the temples in a way she hadn't decided yet how she felt about. What she also knew, she had spent 14 years as a senior investigator with the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, specifically the Special Litigation Section, which is the unit responsible for identifying and documenting pattern or practice violations by law enforcement agencies. In that time, she had overseen investigations of 11 police departments in 8 states, had conducted or supervised hundreds of hours of field interviews and document reviews and depositions, had sat in rooms with police chiefs and union lawyers and city attorneys and federal judges, and had been trained, essentially, by sheer repetition, to read the architecture of what was happening to her even while it was happening. She had left the job 14 months ago when her mother's diagnosis made it clear that someone needed to be more available than the job permitted. She still had contacts. She still knew every procedural requirement, every constitutional threshold, every radio code and booking standard and rights obligation that applied to what was happening to her right now, on this shoulder, on this empty rural road in this August heat. The lanyard in her bag was from her last conference in D.C., which she'd attended in March, a habit-of-the-pocket thing, the way you carry a hotel keycard from a room you've already checked out of. She hadn't thought about it when she packed. There had been no reason to. She was not here to do anything, she was just driving through. She stood on the shoulder with her hands at her sides and looked at the road. He came to stand near her between her and the car in a position that felt casual and was not. This a rental? Yes. Memphis Airport. That's right. He held her license up slightly, though he'd already registered all of it. Mara Voss, that's not a common name. My grandmother was German. He looked at the license again with the studied air of a man reading a menu he has already decided from. Ohio plates, you live in Columbus. I do. What do you do up there? She felt the calibration of the question, the casual register of it, the way it was designed to feel like conversation. She had used this technique herself, the sideways approach that extracts more than the direct question would. I'm between positions right now, she said. Between positions, he repeated it as if tasting the phrase. What kind of work? Government work mostly. I took a leave of absence. He looked at her, his face showed nothing specific, just the alert attention of a man filing things. You come through Millhaven before? I don't think so, I usually take the interstate. What made you go the back way today? I wanted a quieter drive. I looked it up on the map and it seemed straightforward. He looked down at the rental agreement and then back at her. He was standing at an angle that put her slightly against the car, not pinned exactly, but positioned in a way that was not accidental. Mind if I take a look in your trunk? She looked at him. Do you have a reason to search the vehicle? I said look, not search. The smile appeared in the lower half of his face, a brief contraction of the muscles around his mouth that didn't reach his eyes. I've got a K9 unit that can be here in about 15 minutes if you'd rather do it that way. The K9 unit for the Millhaven Police Department was a single dog, a German shepherd named Ajax, who belonged to a part-time officer named Kurt Dewey who worked commercial construction during the week and drove a maroon pickup with a dog box in the bed. Ajax had been certified in 2022 and not recertified since. 2 months prior, a memo, 3 paragraphs unsigned, filed into a shared drive folder nobody checked, had noted that Ajax's working status had been suspended pending a recertification that had not yet been scheduled. Nobody had formally communicated this to patrol officers. Perhaps nobody had thought to. Perhaps it was fine that they hadn't because there had been no need, because this had never come up, because nothing like this had ever come up. Mara looked at the field. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the patrol unit parked at its careful angle behind her car, the angle that kept the dash cam pointed at nothing useful. Okay, she said. She walked to the back of the car and opened the trunk. A rolling carry-on, navy blue, with a tag from a trip to D.C. she'd made in late winter. A reusable grocery bag with crackers, peanut butter, and 2 bottles of water for the drive. A thin emergency kit, the kind folded into the felt corner of every rental. He put on gloves before he touched anything. This registered, the gloves were not for her protection. He lifted the carry-on's lid and looked inside, then set it back. He lifted the emergency kit and set it back. He squeezed the grocery bag without opening it. What's in the bag on the seat? He said, pointing through the rear window at the canvas tote on the passenger seat. Books, phone charger, notebook, reading glasses. Mind if I see it? She turned around to face him directly. He was close, closer than the examination required, with the open trunk behind her and the geometry of the patrol unit creating a space that was not quite a trap but was shaped like one. She looked at him for a moment before she spoke. "I'd like to know what you're looking for," she said. "Just routine." "You stopped me for a brake light. What's routine about searching my personal bag?" Something crossed his face, not anger, something more like the particular irritation of a man whose routine has been named. "It's standard procedure on a traffic stop." "It isn't," she said, not aggressive, informational, the way you'd correct a factual error. His jaw moved slightly. "Hand me the bag, Ms. Voss. I don't consent to a search of my belongings." The words were simple and quiet. She said them with the same register she'd used to answer his other questions, which is to say, easily, without performance, the way you say something you've thought about before and are simply reporting. She was looking at him steadily. Her hands were at her sides. She had the settled quality of someone who is not going to be moved by his silence or his nearness or the practiced weight of his authority, and he could feel this. She could see him feel it. The way you see a man recognize that a door is locked. He was quiet for 15 seconds. A Peterbilt came through on the road, hauling something tarped and heavy, moving fast, its wake pushing a brief hot curtain of air against them both. Then it was gone and the road was empty again, and the insect in the soybean field resumed its single-held note. "Step over here for me," he said. He moved toward the front of the car, away from the shoulder, away from the dash cam's range by another 15 feet. She didn't move. "I said step over here. I'm fine here." She watched him make a decision. It was visible in the way that decisions are sometimes visible in people. A small resettling, a slight shift in the architecture of the face, the thing that happens when the last restraint comes off. "Put your hands behind your back, Ms. Voss. Am I being detained or am I free to go?" "You're being arrested." "On what charge?" "Obstruction. You're interfering with a lawful investigation." She looked at him for one more moment, a held second, then she put her hands behind her back and waited. She did not argue, she did not cry. She did not ask him if he knew who she was, which she could feel him expecting, some version of "do you know what you're doing," something he could use. She said nothing while he cuffed her, said nothing while he walked her to the patrol unit, said nothing while he put his hand on the crown of her head and guided her into the back seat, that procedural gesture, the hand that is technically for safety and in practice is something else entirely. The car smelled of cedar air freshener and old coffee from a cup wedged between the seat and the console. The seat was molded plastic, hard and warm from the afternoon. Through the mesh partition she watched him walk back to her car, pull on a second pair of gloves and open the passenger door. She watched him take the canvas tote. She watched the road still empty, the shimmer still rising from the asphalt, the crow still on the sign in the brush. She counted her breaths, she thought about what she was going to do. Millhaven had one traffic light, at the intersection of Route 9 and Cutter Road, and it had been yellow flashing for 3 weeks because the town had not yet gotten around to scheduling the repair. The population sign at the northern edge said 5,800, though most people who'd grown up there suspected the actual number was closer to 4,000, the rest being optimism or old census data or some combination. There was a Dollar General, 2 churches of different denominations that had maintained a productive competitive tension for 4 decades. A diner called Patsy's that had changed owners 4 times since 1974 and still said Patsy's. A grain elevator that still worked, a cotton gin that didn't, a VFW post with 3 regulars and a parking lot larger than it needed. And a police department that operated out of a building that had previously been a savings and loan and before that a feed store, and which still smelled faintly of grain in the summer when the heat came up through the floors. Chief Gary Hollies ran the department with 8 officers, 2 patrol vehicles, 1 truck, and a budget that had not increased in 3 years. Dale Pruitt was his senior patrolman and had been for 9 years. Dale was the one you called for the domestics a younger officer couldn't settle, for the stops that needed paperwork precise enough to hold, for the arrests where someone might later try to find a seam. He was good at the job in the ways that mattered to Gary, which is to say he produced results and didn't require management, and knew the town's complicated map of relationships well enough to navigate it without causing unnecessary friction. The complaints were something Gary thought about only when he had to. Tammy Breck had come in on a Tuesday morning 14 months ago. 28 years old, worked the register at the Dollar General, drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked taillight she couldn't afford to fix. She'd filled out the complaint form in careful small printing, the letters even and deliberate, like she'd thought about each word before she committed it to the paper and had not wanted to waste the space. 3 stops in 6 weeks. The last one on a Tuesday night on Cutter Road, dark by then, the store already behind her. The hand on her arm when she tried to take back her license. The words he'd said, which she'd written out in full because the form had space and she'd decided to use it. Gary had read the form once at his desk and again at home that night, at the kitchen table with the TV off and his wife already asleep. He'd thought about it for 2 days. He'd called Dale into his office and told him there was a complaint on file and watched Dale's face go through several things before settling into a calm that Gary had learned to recognize as managed rather than genuine, the calm of a man who has already prepared for this conversation. Dale had said that Tammy Breck had a documented history of traffic violations and that he'd been doing his job and that the characterization of the stop in the complaint was inaccurate. He'd said this without raising his voice, without heat, in the flat, reasonable tone of a man who knows what he's going to say before he says it. Gary had noted the conversation in a file. The file had gone into a drawer. 2 weeks after Tammy filed the complaint, Dale had stopped her again, run her plates, told her registration was fine, sent her on her way. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't said anything that could be quoted. He just stopped her the way he was allowed to stop anyone and made sure she understood that he'd seen the form with her name on it. Nobody had done anything about this because nobody had known. Except Renee Calhoun at Dispatch, who'd seen the complaint come through the shared system and mentioned it to Dale in a private conversation, and who had understood this to be the kind of consideration that relationships naturally generate, the low path that water takes without deciding to. Dale drove his routes, kept his hours, called his mother on Sundays, walked his beagle. He drank 2 or 3 Bud Lights most evenings, never enough to show in the morning. He was not stupid. He understood that the power he had was finite and required selectivity, that the people you applied it to needed to be chosen carefully, uncertain, traveling without the kind of connections that turned a complaint into a consequence. He had an instinct for it, a reader's eye for the particular aloneness that signified safety. In another accounting, Dale Pruitt was not a monster. He had coached youth baseball for 6 years until Sandra left and he stopped, and some of those kids still waved at him from across a parking lot. He was the first officer on scene at a bad accident on Route 11 2 years back and had stayed with a teenage girl for 40 minutes in the rain, holding her hand, talking to her steadily, until the paramedics got her on a board. He had paid for his neighbor's groceries twice when she was between things quietly without making it an event. He called his mother on Sundays because he genuinely missed her, not out of obligation. He was also a man in whom something had curdled, not recently and not from any single event that could be named and processed, more gradually, the way a tide changes a shoreline grain by grain, so slowly you don't see the change until one day the shape of the coast has become something it wasn't. 19 years of being the authority in every room he entered. 19 years of people adjusting when he came in. Sandra had said once, 3 months before she left, that she couldn't remember the last time he'd been uncertain about anything, and she hadn't said it admiringly. He'd thought about that in the months after she was gone, had turned it over, examined it, eventually set it aside, because what she was describing sounded to him like strength and he wasn't sure what she wanted him to apologize for. What Gary Hollies understood about Dale and had never said directly was that Dale had learned over the years to treat the uniform as an extension of himself rather than as a responsibility he wore. The distinction was small enough that it was invisible until a situation revealed it. A man who treats authority as a responsibility is constrained by it. A man who has absorbed it into his identity uses it fluidly, naturally, without deliberation, and is therefore capable of things that deliberation might have stopped. He had read Mara Voss from a quarter-mile away. Ohio rental plates. A woman driving alone on an empty road at the end of the afternoon, her posture carrying the slight forward lean of someone who has been driving since noon and is watching the miles. He had not read what was underneath. The Millhaven Police Department's booking area had 2 holding cells, a bathroom with a door that stuck, an inventory table bolted to the wall, and a camera mounted in the corner that the department was supposed to check weekly. The camera had been working intermittently for 2 months. Dale knew this. He'd mentioned it to Gary twice. Gary had said he'd get someone to look at it and hadn't, and at some point Dale had stopped thinking of this as a problem and started thinking of it as a condition of the space, the way you stop noticing a draft once you've accepted it as part of the room. He brought her in at 7:22 p.m. Desk officer was Freddie Moss, 24, 11 months on the job, from Jonesboro originally, with the careful earnestness of a young man who still believed that doing things right and doing them correctly were the same thing. He looked at Mara Voss with an expression he couldn't quite prevent, not recognition exactly, but attention. The attention you give something when your gut sends a signal your brain hasn't yet translated. Charge, he said to Dale. Obstruction, run her Mara Claire Voss, Columbus, Ohio. Freddie typed. Dale took the canvas tote to the inventory table and began pulling items out. Paperback novel, a second paperback she'd been prepared for a long drive, a reporter's notebook with wire spiral at the top, handwriting in blue ink that he glanced at without being able to read quickly, something that looked like journal entries or running notes. He set it face down, a phone charger, a glasses case, a travel pack of Kleenex, a cell phone set separately, a wallet. At the bottom of the bag, tangled in the corner seam where things get caught when a bag has been carried and repacked too many times, was a lanyard. Navy blue, white lettering. He picked it up and read it. U.S. Department of Justice. He held it for 3 seconds. He set it down with the other items in the careful way of a man setting something down that he would like to be able to say he barely noticed. He did not look at Mara Voss, who was seated in the plastic chair by Freddie's desk and who was not looking at him either. You're entitled to one phone call, he said, to a point somewhere between her and the wall. I know, she said. She asked for the phone at 7:41. Freddie handed her the desk unit and she dialed from memory a 202 area code, a number she'd called enough times that it lived in her fingers before it lived in her head. It rang twice. Hey, said the voice. A woman, unhurried, with the particular quality of someone who is always slightly ahead of things. It's Mara. I'm in a town called Millhaven, Arkansas. I've been arrested on obstruction by a patrolman named Dale Pruitt, Millhaven PD. Stop me if you need to write any of this down. I'm writing. Stop at approximately mile marker 11 on Route 9 southbound at 6:47 p.m. He cited a brake light. He requested a consent search. I declined. He arrested me. Car is at the scene or impounded silver Hyundai Sonata rental, Ohio plates. She gave the plate number from memory. He inventoried my bag at booking. Gale, he found the DOJ lanyard. A pause. Okay. I need someone to call the facility in Texarkana and let them know I won't make it tonight. The number is in my phone, but you already have it. I'll call tonight. Are you hurt? No, I'm fine. I'll make some calls, Mara. Gale, she paused. She was looking at a point on the wall above Freddie's computer. Don't do anything fast. Give it a day, maybe 2. I want to see what he does with the next 24 hours. A silence on the line, the kind that means someone is choosing words. Mara. I'm fine. This cell is fine. It won't be a long stay. Another pause. This guy has done this before. I could feel the shape of it on the road. I want the picture before anything moves. Freddie Moss was looking at his computer screen with the concentrated, deliberate attention of a man who is carefully not listening to a conversation he is absolutely listening to. His fingers had stopped moving on the keyboard. All right, Gale said, I'll wait on you. Thank you. Mara handed the phone back to Freddie. She said thank you to him too, with the same weight she'd given the word on the phone, and he nodded and didn't entirely understand why he felt the way he felt, which was the way you feel before weather changes, a pressure drop, barely perceptible, that the body registers before the mind catches up. Dale wrote the arrest report in his car in the parking lot, away from the overhead lights of the booking area. He wrote in the practiced, deliberate way of a man who has written reports for 19 years and knows where the seams are. He wrote suspect became non-cooperative and failed to comply with multiple lawful directives. He read this back. He changed non-cooperative to verbally resistant to lawful commands. He wrote that she had refused to step away from the vehicle as directed. He wrote that she had refused to produce personal items for inspection during the course of a lawful traffic stop. He wrote that in his professional judgment the arrest was necessary to prevent further obstruction. He sat back and looked at the parking lot, 3 vehicles including his unit. The sky above Millhaven had gone violet at the edges, the last light refusing to give up, and the air still held the full weight of the day. He called Gary. Gary picked up on the third ring in the way of a man who'd been awake but moving towards sleep. What? I've got a woman in holding, obstruction. Who? Passing through Ohio plates, name's Mara Voss. He paused. Gary, she had a DOJ lanyard in her bag. The silence on the line had a specific quality, not the silence of a man thinking but the silence of a man who already knows what he thinks and is deciding what to say about it. Current or former? Badge was gone, just the lanyard. She said she's between positions. Where was she going? Texarkana, her mother. And you stopped her for? Brake light. Gary was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Dale could hear the TV at Gary's house in the background, something with a laugh track, and Gary's wife saying something at a distance and Gary saying not now in a low voice that had been used for that phrase many times. What did she actually do? Gary said. Not the report, what did she do? She refused to consent to a search and refused to follow directions. Did she touch you? No. Did she threaten you? No. Raise her voice. A pause, no. Gary exhaled a long, rough sound, the sound a man makes before lifting something heavy that he would rather not lift. Write the report clean, I mean all of it clean, don't add anything, don't explain anything that isn't already there. I know how to write a report. I know you do, write it like someone's going to read it carefully. He let that sit. Get a lawyer, Dale, not Millhaven, someone from Little Rock. You think this is? I think she made a phone call and I think whoever she called is going to make more calls. I'll be in at 6. He hung up. Dale sat in the parking lot until the violet was gone from the sky and the stars were out and the parking lot was lit only by the security light on the corner of the building, which buzzed faintly with a frequency you only noticed in silence. He thought about the lanyard. He thought about between positions and what that meant for someone who'd worked at the DOJ. He thought about the way she'd talked on the roadside, not the words but the register, the quality of calm that had not been submissiveness and not been bravado but something more precise than either, the quality of someone who knows exactly where they are. He finished the report, printed it, signed it, left it in the folder on Freddie's desk. He drove home, walked Hank, drank 2 Bud Lights on the porch and went to bed at 10:30 and lay looking at the ceiling until past midnight. She slept. Freddie checked on her at midnight and found her on the cot with her arm over her eyes, breathing with the evenness of someone who has made a deliberate decision to rest. He stood at the cell door for a moment longer than he needed to, then went back to his desk. Before she'd gone to the cell, she had asked him 3 questions in the quiet, matter-of-fact way of someone taking notes mentally. Whether the department had a written K-9 deployment policy. Whether Officer Prout had called for a K-9 unit over the radio during the traffic stop. Whether there was a dispatch log of that call. He'd said he wasn't certain about the policy and wasn't sure about the radio call. She'd thanked him and said goodnight. He sat at his desk in the quiet building and thought about what she'd asked. He thought about it for 20 minutes, then he pulled up the radio log for the evening. 6:47 p.m., Prout calls in a traffic stop Route 9 Mile 11, standard notation. 7:18 p.m., Prout calls in a 10:15 subject in custody. Nothing in between, no K-9 request, no K-9 dispatch, no mention of Ajax at all. Freddie looked at the log for a while, he printed it, folded it twice and put it in his jacket pocket. He wasn't entirely sure why. He went back to watching the empty parking lot through the front window and stayed there until morning. Gary Hollies arrived at 5:50, 10 minutes early. Freddie was still at the desk, overnight having called in sick, no replacement arranged. Gary went directly to the holding cell and looked through the door. Mara Voss was awake, sitting on the cot, her hair pulled back with a rubber band from her wrist. She was looking at the wall with the expression of someone who has been thinking steadily for 8 hours and has arrived at conclusions. Ms. Voss, Gary said. She turned her head. I'm Chief Hollies. I want to apologize for the circumstances of last night. He said it in the tone of a man who is not exactly apologizing but who has determined that apology is the correct instrument for the current situation. She looked at him. Are the charges being dropped? Gary was quiet. If the charges aren't being dropped, she said, we don't have much productive ground to cover right now. No offense meant by that. Gary put his hands in his pockets. He was 61, heavyset, with the weathered, careful face of a man who had spent decades standing in rooms where things needed managing. He had managed a great many things in Millhaven. He had managed Tammy Breck's complaint and the nursing student's complaint and a half-dozen smaller things before those, and he was good at it, patient, measured, understanding leverage. The town of Millhaven ran on a set of relationships he had spent 30 years maintaining. The kind of relationships that require everyone to agree, implicitly, not to look too hard at certain things. He looked at Mara Voss now and understood, with the specific instinct of a man whose instrument has found resistance, that he was in new territory. Can I ask who you called last night? He said. A friend. In Washington. She didn't answer. He nodded once. I'm releasing you this morning. We'll get your car from impound. Was it damaged during impound, or during Officer Pruitt's search? I don't believe so. I need a written inventory of everything that was in my bag, signed and witnessed before I leave the building. We can do that. I also want to note on the record that I'm preserving the right to review all radio logs, dispatch records and body camera footage from the stop. A pause. Something in Gary's face adjusted very slightly. Officer Pruitt's body camera is currently in for servicing. When was it submitted for servicing? He paused. I'd have to check the date. She looked at him the way people look when they're not surprised by something and are not going to pretend to be. Chief Holly's, one question. He waited. How long has Officer Pruitt been with the department? 19 years. She nodded. She looked at the wall again. He left to make the release arrangements and stood in the hallway for a moment alone afterward, with the particular feeling of a man who has just watched a door close on a room he will not be getting back into. She was processed out at 7:15 a.m. They returned her phone, wallet, books, charger, glasses, Kleenex, notebook, and everything else from the inventory list, and Freddie produced the signed sheet and had Officer Tanner, who just arrived on day shift, witness it. Mara read the list carefully, checked each item against what was on the table, signed her copy, and folded it into the tote bag. Her car was 4 blocks away. She walked in the early morning heat, which was already asserting itself at 73 degrees, and at the impound lot she circled the car once before getting in, checking the trunk line and the window seals and the door gaps the way you do when you want to know if someone was inside. She checked the glove box and center console and door pockets. She noticed the passenger seat was slightly forward of where she'd left it. She noticed the floor mat on the passenger side was sitting fractionally off its seat guides, replaced but not replaced exactly. She started the car and drove to Patsy's. She ate scrambled eggs and wheat toast and drank 2 cups of coffee, and the teenage waitress refilled the cup without being asked and left her alone. After breakfast, Mara sat for 20 minutes with her reporter's notebook open. She wrote in the compressed, systematic style of someone accustomed to writing things that may later be read in court. Times, positions, verbatim quotes rendered as close as memory permitted, physical details. The 45-degree angle of the patrol unit. The position changes on the roadside, how he'd moved her toward the front of the car, away from the dash cam range. The K9 claim, the inventory, the lanyard, and the 3 seconds he'd held it. Gary Holly's answer about the body camera. She wrote it twice. Then she paid her bill, tipped $6 on a $12 breakfast, and drove to Texarkana. 2 days later, a woman named Carmen Ellison arrived in Millhaven. She was 36, drove a rented Fusion, wore a linen shirt and jeans, and stopped at the Dollar General before going anywhere official. She needed a bottle of water, which was true, but she also needed to look at who was working the register. Tammy Breck had brown hair and watchful eyes, and she handed back Carmen's change without looking up, in the automatic way of someone who has learned not to make eye contact with strangers. Carmen took her water and was almost to the door before she stopped. Is there a Tammy who works here? I may have the wrong store. Tammy looked up. That's me. Carmen spoke quietly. The store was empty except for them. My name is Carmen Ellison. I'm with the Department of Justice. She placed a card on the counter. No pressure, no obligation, but if you ever wanted to talk to someone about an experience you had, I'd be glad to listen. She went back to her car. Through the window, she watched Tammy Breck pick up the card and read it for a long time. Then Tammy put it in her apron pocket. Her face when she did it was the face of someone who is deciding not to decide yet, which is its own kind of decision. Carmen drove to the county library and spent 3 hours with public records, arrest reports, traffic stop logs, complaint documentation, call logs. She made notes. She flagged names and dates and gaps in logging that had the particular quality of things that aren't accidental, gaps that appear at consistent intervals, around consistent types of stops, and then disappear again, as if someone had learned where the edge of visibility was and learned to stay just inside it. She called Gail Dunbar at 2 in the afternoon. He's been doing this a while, Carmen said. There are stops in the arrest record with no corresponding radio log entry. The Breck complaint is in the system, but the follow-up documentation is missing. There's a form reference, but the form itself isn't attached. She paused. The body camera Dale Pruitt's unit was supposedly using has been in for servicing. No record of when it was submitted. When do you want to talk to dispatch? As soon as the county attorney gives me the green light. Day after tomorrow maybe. Who's the county prosecutor? A man named Waverly. Gary Hollies called him within 3 hours of getting our initial inquiry. Waverly's not stupid. He hasn't called Gary back. Tammy Breck called the number on Carmen's card that evening, from her car in the Dollar General parking lot after her shift. She sat in the hot car for 20 minutes first, engine off, the August heat still climbing even at 8 p.m., and then she called because she had decided that she was going to do it before she talked herself out of it. And she knew herself well enough to know she would talk herself out of it if she waited until she was home. Carmen answered on the second ring. They met at a coffee shop in the next town over, the following afternoon. It was a small place with ceiling fans and laminate tables, and they sat in the back corner and Tammy drank a Coke because she didn't want coffee at 4 in the afternoon, and Carmen ordered a coffee and didn't touch it, and they talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Tammy was precise. She'd been over it enough times in her own head that the narrative was clean, organized chronologically, and she told it that way. The first stop, which she'd written off as ordinary bad luck, her taillight being genuinely out at the time. The second stop, 2 weeks later, different violation, different road. The way he'd stood at her window, different from a normal stop, closer, his body angled toward the door in a way that made her feel the door was not something she could use. The third stop, what he'd said, the hand on her arm, 3 fingers not grabbing, just resting there when she reached for her license. What he'd said while the hand was there. She described the words clearly. She had said them to herself so many times that they had lost some of their heat and become instead something clinical, a sequence of events she could report. Did you feel physically threatened? Carmen asked. I felt like I was supposed to feel threatened, Tammy said. I felt like that was the whole point. Carmen wrote that down verbatim. After you filed the complaint, Carmen said, what changed? He stopped me again 2 weeks later. He just ran my plates and told me my registration was fine. She turned her Coke slowly on the table. I knew immediately that someone had told him. The complaint was filed on a Tuesday morning. He stopped me on a Thursday. I'd been at the store all week. There's one road from my apartment to the store. She looked up. He knew I filed it. Someone in that building told him. Did you file anything after that? No, she was quiet for a moment. I started going a different way to work. It takes 6 minutes longer. She looked at the table. I want you to know that I know how that sounds. I know what I should have done. You filed a complaint, Carmen said. That was the right thing. What happened after wasn't on you. Tammy looked at her carefully, the look of someone assessing whether this was something being said to make her feel better or something being said because it was true. She seemed to find both, or enough of both. Okay, she said. Carmen called Gail that evening. Breck's testimony is solid. She's credible, she's organized, and she's not angry in the way that reads badly on a stand. She's measured. Whatever Dale Pruitt was counting on when he stopped her a second time, it wasn't that she'd be this coherent 3 years later. Did she know about the Voss arrest before you contacted her? She saw it in the news. She said she'd been sitting on it for 3 days trying to figure out whether it was the same guy she was thinking of. Pause. It was. They spoke with Renee Calhoun on the fourth day. She was 31 with dark hair and the composed, slightly brittle quality of someone who has been preparing for a difficult conversation for several days and has rehearsed the control she intends to show. Her attorney, a woman from Fayetteville named Prather, sat beside her and knew which way things were pointing. Renee answered questions directly. She described the arrangement with Dale, not frequent, not systematic in any planned way, but whenever he mentioned that something needed to not be in the log, she took it out. He didn't always say it directly. Sometimes it was the way he didn't mention something in a room where it would have been normal to mention it, and she understood from the absence. She had understood from early on. She said clearly that she knew what she was doing. The Breck complaint, Carmen said. How did Officer Prout know about it before formal notification? Renee looked at her hands. He asked me to check the system. He does that sometimes, runs names to see if anything's come in. I told him there was a complaint filed. And then he stopped her again 2 weeks later. Yes. Did he ask you to do anything to the complaint itself, modify it or remove it? No, he knew it was already visible. It would have been too obvious. She paused. He didn't need it gone, he just needed her to know he'd seen it. The room held that for a moment. Ms. Calhoun, Carmen said, were there other women, other stops that were removed from the log? Renee kept looking at her hands. Her attorney touched her arm briefly. She looked up. 3 that I know of, maybe 4, I'm not certain about one. I don't know if I removed it because he asked me to or if it was already incomplete in the system by the time I got to it. Carmen made a note. David Park across from her made a note. The recorder on the table continued its patient work. I knew it was wrong, Renee said, unprompted at the end. I want that in whatever you write down. I knew what it was. It'll be in there, Carmen said. What they found in Kevin Tull's files. Tull had been a patrol officer with Millhaven PD for 6 years and had left in 2021 for reasons he described in his own statement as not wanting to be around anymore. He had on his last day copied 2 years of incident logs to a personal drive and taken them home. Not as evidence of anything specific, he said. He hadn't witnessed anything he could name. He just felt the weight of the pattern and hadn't known what to do with it, and had taken the logs the way you take an umbrella when you can't read the sky. The logs covered 2 additional traffic stops of women traveling alone on Route 9 that had never been formally recorded, that existed in no official database, that had simply been conducted and then not written down. Tull didn't know the women's names. Nobody did. They were stops that had happened and been absorbed by the silence of a town that had agreed not to look at certain things, and they might have stayed that way forever if Tull hadn't kept his files in a locked drawer in his garage for 3 years, not quite knowing why. I kept thinking I'd need them someday, he told Carmen. The federal interrogation of Dale Prout took place in a conference room at the federal building in Little Rock, 12 days after the arrest. Dale came with Greer, who had told him 3 things before they went in: answer only what was asked, do not elaborate, do not try to be charming. Dale wore a button-down shirt, no tie. He had shaved carefully. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at Park and Ellison with the expression of a man who has calculated that if he stays calm enough he can hold his position. Let's talk about the stop on August 7th, Park said. Okay. You stopped Ms. Voss at approximately 6:47 p.m. That's right. Basis for the stop. Brake light violation, right rear. Is that documented in your stop report? A pause, it's referenced in the initial notation. Park slid the report across the table. The initial notation says, quote, traffic violation observed. It doesn't name the violation. That's the standard notation format. We reviewed 32 other stop reports from your unit over the 6 preceding months. In 27 of them, the specific violation is named in the initial notation. Park placed a second sheet next to the first. In the 5 where it isn't, 3 resulted in no citation being issued and no violation listed in any subsequent documentation. Dale looked at the papers. His hands on the table were still. A vein moved once in his jaw and stopped. Did you request a K-9 unit during the stop? Park asked. I informed Ms. Voss that a K-9 unit was available. Did you put in a request? I stated that it was available. The radio log for that evening shows no K-9 request between the time you called in the stop and the time you called in the arrest. Can you explain that? Pause. I made the K-9 statement to inform Ms. Voss of her options. So you told her a K-9 unit could be there in 15 minutes, your exact words, per Ms. Voss's statement, without calling for one. Greer put his hand on Dale's arm briefly. Dale said, I'm not going to answer it the way you framed it. Park made a note. Ellison had not spoken yet. She was watching Dale's hands. He knew she was watching his hands, and he knew that he knew this, and the triple consciousness of it, being watched, knowing it, managing the knowing, was visible in the careful stillness he was maintaining, the maintenance itself becoming a kind of tell. Officer Prout, Carmen said, I want to ask you about Tammy Breck. Something moved in Dale's face. Controlled but present, a brief tightening around the eyes, a fractional lift of the jaw, the movement of something coming to the surface and being pushed back down. He looked at Carmen with the look of a man whose private accounting has just been handed to someone else, and he was looking at it in their hands. I'm aware of the complaint, he said. We've reviewed it. I want to ask specifically about the stop that occurred 14 days after Ms. Breck filed the complaint. Can you walk me through that stop? She had a traffic violation. What violation? I'd have to check the report. There is no report, Carmen said. There is no log entry for that stop. Ms. Breck has described the stop in detail in a recorded statement. Did that stop occur? Dale looked at the table. The muscle in his jaw moved again. I'd like to take a break, he said. Sure, Carmen said, of course. The break was 12 minutes. When they came back, Greer spoke for 2 minutes about scope and admissibility, and Park and Carmen listened without interruption. They resumed. Dale answered 4 more questions. Greer ended the session. In the elevator down, Carmen said to Park, he knows exactly where the line is. He's been standing on it for years, Park said. He thought he could hold it. They always do, Park said. The elevator opened to the lobby, right up until they can't. The federal indictment came down 5 weeks after the arrest. Dale Prout was charged with 2 counts under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. The first count addressed the arrest of Mara Voss on August 7th, unlawful detention, unlawful arrest, unlawful search, denial of constitutional rights by a person acting under color of law. The second count addressed the stop of Tammy Breck following the complaint filing, which the indictment characterized as willful intimidation of a person who had exercised her right to report misconduct. The DOJ complaint attached to the indictment also cited a documented pattern of conduct going back 22 months, supported by Freddie Moss's radio log, the recorded testimony of Tammy Breck, Kevin Tull's files, and the cooperation agreement testimony of Renee Calhoun, which detailed the nature and frequency of log manipulation over 8 months. Renee Calhoun was charged separately under a single obstruction count and entered a plea within a week of the indictment. Gary Hollies took administrative leave the day the federal complaint became public. He announced his retirement 3 weeks later in a 2-paragraph statement citing his health and his desire to spend time with family. He made no mention of Dale Prout or Mara Voss or Tammy Breck or any of the names that had been in the news for a month. He called Tammy Breck from his personal cell on a Sunday evening, and she listened to him for about 2 minutes and said okay and hung up and stood in her kitchen for a long time afterward holding the phone. The Millhaven Gazette ran the story on Tuesday, below the fold on page 1, then again on Friday above the fold with a photograph of the police department building that made it look small and sun-bleached and a little sad. Local television came from Little Rock. One cable network ran a 7-minute segment on systemic misconduct in rural law enforcement that showed a map of Millhaven and mentioned a veteran patrolman and a Department of Justice investigator traveling alone without nomming either, and got 700,000 views in 2 days. A reporter from a national outlet reached Mara Voss by phone. She didn't know how they'd gotten her number, and she listened to his questions politely and said she had no comment, and when he called back she let it go to voicemail. The Millhaven PD was placed under a consent monitoring agreement pending the conclusion of the federal case. An interim chief named Torres came in from the state police to run the department, while a search was conducted for a permanent replacement. Freddie Moss was asked to stay on during the transition and did, and Carmen Ellison noted in her summary report that his preservation of the radio log had been a significant contribution to the investigation's timeline. She asked him in a brief follow-up conversation what had made him print it that night. "He thought about it. I didn't want it to get lost," he said finally. "I didn't know that anything would come of it. I just didn't want it to get lost." Carmen put that in her notes too. Dale's attorney filed 2 motions to dismiss on procedural grounds. Both were denied. The trial was set for the following April. Greer was, by all accounts, building a capable defense, contesting the pattern of practice framing, challenging the admissibility of Tull's archived logs, arguing that Renee Calhoun's cooperation testimony was incentivized in ways that affected its weight. It was the kind of defense that takes 6 months to construct carefully, the kind that acknowledges it cannot win everywhere and so determines where it can. It might work in parts, it might not work at all. The federal conviction rate on 18 U.S.C. Section 242 cases that reach trial is close to 80%, a fact Greer knew and did not share with Dale, though Dale was smart enough to have found it himself. In the meantime, Dale went home to the house on Winslow Street and walked Hank and answered Greer's calls and sat on the porch in the evenings when the heat let up. And the street had the particular quiet of a neighborhood that is being careful around him, the quiet of people who are pretending not to know what they know. He could feel it. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to recognize managed distance and to know when it was being managed at him. He was not the kind of man who collapsed under this. He was the kind of man who became very still. He sat on the porch in the evenings with his Bud Light and watched the street and thought whatever it was he thought, which was private and which no court document would ever fully contain, because the particular interior of a man who has done damage and is waiting for the accounting is not a thing that gets written into the record. Some evenings his mother called. She'd seen something on the news and was worried. He told her it was complicated. He told her he was fine. He told her he loved her and hung up. Hank slept at his feet. The street stayed quiet. September arrived and the nights came a little earlier each week. The last interview Mara Voss gave to the federal attorneys was conducted remotely, via secure video, on a Thursday afternoon in October. She was at her apartment in Columbus. She wore a blue sweater. She answered every question directly and without hesitation, and the session lasted 2 hours and 22 minutes, and when it was over she closed her laptop and sat in the specific quiet of a thing that is finished, or nearly. She had received, in the weeks since the story broke, calls from 3 media organizations, a podcast producer, 2 civil rights attorneys looking at a parallel civil suit, a woman from Ohio who wrote crime journalism and wanted to do a profile, and a documentary producer who had emailed twice and called when the emails weren't answered. All legitimate. All things she would eventually need to make decisions about. She had made none of those decisions yet. She picked up her phone and called the memory care facility in Texarkana. The woman at the front desk said her mother had had a good afternoon. Mara said she'd be there next week. The memory care facility was called Sunrise Gardens, which announced its intention before you got through the door, and the interior matched pale yellow walls, carpet the color of dried grass, plants maintained by a service that came on Tuesdays. The hallway to room 14 was 42 steps from the front desk, and Mara knew this the way you know distances in places you've walked enough times that the body memorizes the path while the mind was elsewhere. Her mother's name was Elaine. She was 73 and she moved through the world now in the way of someone standing in a river, the current of the present flowing around her while she held still. On the better days, she knew Mara's name and knew that Mara was her daughter and knew that Mara lived somewhere north, Ohio, she thought, cold winters. On the harder days, she knew that someone had come to visit and was glad of it without being able to say why. And on the hardest days, there was just the world and her place in it and the warmth of a hand nearby. Mara arrived on a Thursday in early November when the drive down was cool and the pecans along Route 71 had dropped and lay in the verges. She signed in and walked the 42 steps and found room 14 empty, and the nurse on duty pointed toward the garden. The small courtyard off the east wing, 3 concrete planters, a wooden bench, an apple tree that predated the building. The afternoon light was November light, low and golden, flattened, the kind that comes in at an angle that summer never permits, and it moved through the trees' remaining leaves and fell in uneven patches on the concrete. Elaine was on the bench, white hair combed, a pale blue cardigan over her blouse, hands in her lap. She was looking at the tree. She turned when she heard the door. Something moved across her face. Toward Mara, a reaching, a warmth that didn't resolve into the specific word daughter but was unmistakably love, the kind that persists below the level of language, the last thing to go. "You came," she said. "I did," Mara said. She sat down beside her mother on the bench. Elaine reached over and took her hand without ceremony, the way she had taken her hand since Mara was 4 years old, naturally, as though her daughter's hand were an extension of her own reach, as though it had always been right there. Mara's phone was in her pocket with its 17 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She left it there. They sat in the garden while the light went slowly down. Somewhere across the facility, a door opened and a voice said something ordinary, and was answered, and then everything was quiet and it was just the two of them and the bench and the tree with its one last apple up in the high fork of 2 branches, small, greenish yellow, too old to pick. The kind of thing that makes it into fall simply by being too easy to overlook, too small to be worth the trouble, hanging there in the still air as if it had decided to stay a little longer. As if staying were a choice it had made and intended to keep. Elaine squeezed her hand. The light moved across the concrete and faded, and the evening came in quietly from the edges, and neither of them said anything more. End.